Hello everyone, and welcome back to another discussion, this one of Cantos 11, 12, and 13 of the Inferno. In Canto 11, we get Virgil's account of the structure of hell, but we don't get it in a way that's contextual or expository. We get it in a way that feels verisimilar, that is, true to life. Virgil and the pilgrim are waiting for their noses to acclimate to the smell, and in order to make the most of their time, Virgil tells the pilgrim about the way that hell is set up below, with the divisions into the sins of incontinence, the sins of malice, violence, and fraud. In Canto 12, we enter finally the seventh of hell's 9 circles, which is itself divided into 3 separate circles. This is the circle for the violent, and it's divided into violent against others, violent against self, and violent against God. We meet first the violent against others, who are plunged into a river of blood and submerged in varying degrees according to the gravity and heinousness of their sins. In Inferno 13, we enter into the second ring of this 7th circle, the violent against themselves, that is, the suicides. It's important to note that though we don't regard it as such today, suicide was looked at during the Christian Middle Ages as a sin because it meant discarding or not valuing that which God had granted us. This certainly isn't a universal viewpoint. There are thinkers in Greek and Roman antiquity who certainly regarded suicide as an alternative preferable to, for instance, suffering the fate of living under a tyrant. The first thing to say about the landscape of this canto is that it is a dark wood, not unlike the dark wood with which the Inferno began. This should prompt us to ask some questions about why Dante would want to reuse that material, why he would want us to cast our minds back to the state in which he found himself at the very beginning. The language with which the canto begins is filled with negation. No green leaves in that forest, only black. No branches, straight and smooth but knotted and gnarled. No fruits were there, but briars bearing poison. So this is a realistic description of a dark and frightening place, but it is also filled with metaphor that pertain to the state of mind of one who is suffering and whose suffering will lead to the act of suicide. That is, it is filled with negation, privation, and deprivation. The way that Dante phrases it, it is also filled with possibility that's evoked only to be negated. No leaves, no fruit. There is a cycle implicit here of disappointment, frustration, and negation. Dante finds that in fact the sinners are not hiding behind the trees, but have themselves been metamorphosed into trees. The only way they can speak is when someone breaks off a piece of their branch, as Virgil in fact encourages Dante to do. The description of this passage is marvelous. At line 40, as from a sapling log that catches fire along one of its ends, while at the other it drips and hisses with escaping vapor, so from that broken stump issued together both words and blood. It's a strikingly visualizable passage. It really remains in one's memory after you've read it, and it also seems to convey something of the soul's yearning to speak, but inability to do so. They're passive and must remain there waiting for someone to act upon them. And again, this is a metaphor for the psychological state of someone suffering so greatly and so intensely that the only escape they can find is suicide. As with Paolo and Francesca, what you'll notice here is that Dante is interested in the psychology of sin, that is, the processes and mechanisms whereby someone's mind arrives at this conclusion and at the thought that there's no other way out but to take one's own life. The soul whom we meet, as it turns out, is named Pier della Vigna. He was a real historical figure, a famous jurist, writer, poet, and the primary minister to the Roman Emperor, Frederick II. We'll hear much more about Frederick II, but for now, I want you to know that he was a ruler of great cultural and intellectual acclaim. He was a patron of the arts and of poetry in particular. His castle and his royal court in Sicily were renowned, and he was bitterly opposed to the papacy. In fact, Frederick II was excommunicated multiple times under multiple popes. The historical record on Pier della Vigna accords with what Dante offers here. He was in fact imprisoned on charges of treason, and blinded first probably by those who imprisoned him. What Dante offers us here, as he offered us in the case of Paolo and Francesca, is a look into the dark, locked room where the final actions occur. Pier died under mysterious circumstances, and Dante's contribution to history at this point, a history that has in fact been taken up by historians after the fiction of this poem, is to suggest that Pier della Vigna died by his own hand. Notice the language and the rhetoric that Pier uses in describing how he arrived at this awful and catastrophic decision. He suggests that that sin, that great sin of the royal court, envy, inflamed minds against him. He uses the passive voice. He uses personification. His language is very much like the trees that Dante describes at the beginning of the canto. That is, they are gnarled and knotted and convoluted. He has led himself into a twisted, knotted tunnel of logic whereby his reasoning can justify to himself the taking of his own life. He was so magnificent with words in life, and that magnificence, that very eloquence, turns against him on the road to his death. He even claims that his own mind turned against itself. As he says, it's my mind that made me unjust against my just self. So Pier della Vigna is a moving and sympathetic figure for Dante. Think of it, he's a poet and a politician, as Dante was. He's opposed to the papacy, as Dante was. And he's falsely accused of betrayal. The only way he sees to escape this great fall, to escape his woeful suffering and the shame of his fallen condition, is to take his own life. Dante must have been looking into a darkened mirror here. I mentioned much earlier in the videos that one of the aspects of the dark wood at the very beginning of the Inferno was the possibility that Dante was thinking about suicide. This canto is precisely why I mentioned that. In essence, Dante looks at Pier della Vigna and thinks, this is one path my life might have taken. Once again, the debate about shades like Pier della Vigna and like Francesca is, to what degree does Dante the poet want us to sympathize with this character? To what degree are we meant to share in the pilgrim's pity and his compassion? And to what degree are we meant instead to see that suffering, but to exercise our own will and our own reason in evaluating his condition? Keep in mind that people like Francesca and people like Piero tell a captivating story. It moves quickly, it's compelling, it's persuasive, but it very rarely ever slows down enough to entertain alternatives. What if I had prayed? What if I had cared for another? In this case, what if I had read the book called Consolations of Philosophy by Boethius, in which a Latin author, in fact, finds himself betrayed, fallen from great fame, and trapped in prison, awaiting execution, and is visited by philosophy to talk himself out of this very fate. I think it's important that we don't take either of these two strong feelings away from the text. On the one hand, we must feel with Piero. On the other, we must slow down with the poet and understand the many avenues available to him. I want to take a brief moment before we leave the canto to visit with the anonymous second shade, the second suicide, whom Dante meets at the end of the canto. All we know about him is that he identifies himself as Florentine. My home, he says, was in the city whose first patron gave way to John the Baptist. For this reason, he'll always make use of his art to make it sorrow. Now, to understand this brief reference, you have to know that the first secular patron of Florence, before it adopted the Christian patron John the Baptist, was none other than the Roman god of war, Mars. The baptistry was believed to be a Roman temple dedicated to the god of war, and there was a famous statue of Mars on the north side of the Ponte Vecchio. So why this brief and obscure reference to Florence and its history put in the mouth of an anonymous suicide, and seemingly blaming the violence and factionalism on its ancient patron. What Dante seems to suggest here is that this is the equivalent of the individual suicide on the level of an entire city. That is, an entire city that has turned against itself, that is blaming others for how it has turned against itself, that has done violence to itself, and that continues to this day down the road of self-destruction. Once again, Dante takes the opportunity to reflect not only on the sin and not only on the psychology of the sin, but on the way the sin extends beyond the individual circumstances and affects the entire culture as a whole. What better way to think about the violence that Florence was inflicting upon itself at the time of his life, at the time of his exile and before, than to frame it in terms of a suicide, of an entire city slowly wreaking upon itself violence and self-destruction.